Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We hope you and yours are sheltering in place in a comfortable environment, and we look forward to welcoming you back to the St. Francis Yacht Club just as soon as this pandemic is in our rearview mirror. Our guest today is very, very timely. He basically has spent 30 years in the Navy as a Navy intelligence officer with 2 tours to Iraq and more than 1,000 days afloat. He's been on aircraft carriers, landing ship docks, and destroyer escorts all over the world, basically serving us in an intelligent capacity. And also, Commander Kohnen is a historian, PhD, maritime historian with a great history, with a great knowledge of naval history. He's going to talk to us today about the Spanish pandemic of 1918-20 and how we can learn from it and what we can learn from it to help us in the COVID pandemic of 2020. David Kohnen, PhD, maritime historian, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Well, thank you so much, Ron. It's such a privilege for me to have the opportunity to speak to this great group and such a historic yacht club. It's really my pleasure to be here. The title of my presentation today is Grippe caught us quicker than the U-boats. And that's a quotation from Captain Ernest J, who was actually the Chief of Staff of the Atlantic Fleet during the First World War. And what's interesting about that quote, I think, is the fact that a goodly number of folks died of the flu, probably more so than in combat during the First World War. And that's really part of the story here. War is one of those events in human history that just seems to happen periodically. And with wars of the past, a lot of times sickness followed. And that's exactly what happened a century ago in the First World War with what became known as the Spanish flu. And the reason it became known as the Spanish flu is because during the First World War, the media was monitored very carefully in Europe. The British were using the media as propaganda. And so they were monitoring how stories were being told, except for in Spain. And when influenza hit Spain, the monarch in Spain came down with influenza, and this made it into the newspapers. And that's why it became known as the Spanish flu. There's some other reasons for that as well, but the primary reason is because the King of Spain came down with the flu. I always like these types of images because it kind of captures a moment. These are Red Cross nurses who are volunteers who are dealing with the flu pandemic in this image. And, you know, with technology today, what's great is people have gone back to these types of images and colorized them. Historians will debate about the value of colorization of historic images. For our purposes today, as long as I tell you that this is colorized, that's all we have to do. I think this does capture the humanity of the pandemic of a century ago. So with that,
Wait a second, David, I want to ask a historic question. I see that this is a colorized photograph. Are you using makeup today?
am I using makeup today? I probably should be using makeup today. I'm also experimenting with my Shakespeare look during the COVID pandemic because I normally do not have facial hair. But me and my friends and I have taken on a challenge. I also have not had a haircut, which doesn't go with my normal look. And, you know, like I said, I'm going for the Shakespeare look, but a lot of my friends tell me that I look a little bit more like Vladimir Lenin. So
that's a whole nother WYL.
Yeah, sure. So I do have a number of slides for you today, and I will tell the story. I'll flip through the slides probably quickly, but we can come back if required. So I'll go ahead and get started. This is an article that I wrote with my good friends, Nathaniel Sims, who's a medical doctor, member of the faculty at Harvard Medical School. and he specializes in heart valve mechanisms, and he has many patents on heart valve mechanisms. So really smart guy, and a great man, a great friend. And then the other guy to the far left is a guy named Nicholas Jellicoe. And Nicholas Jellicoe is the grandson of the first Sea Lord in the First World War, Sir John Rushworth Jellicoe. Nathaniel Sims, coming back to him, is the grandson of Admiral Sims, who will be making appearances today in my presentation. And when I was asked to write this article, I figured, okay, I'll tackle this. I normally don't deal with medical history. However, I said, sure, this is a timely topic and I'll go ahead and tackle it. It's hard to do when you're stuck at home. Not having access to archives made it sort of a challenge. And so I enlisted the assistance of my friends, Nick Jellicoe and Nat Sims, to put together the story that appears in this article. So from left to right, in the picture with the Union Jack, which by the way is a flag that was flown by Admiral Sims at his headquarters in the First World War. From left to right in that picture is Nicholas Jellicoe, myself, when I don't have a beard, and Dr. Nathaniel Sims.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sure.
And the photograph down below, the painting rather, down below.
Yes, that's a painting. That's a painting by a great artist named Gribble, and it depicts the what it's called the surrender of the German High Seas Fleet, but that's a misnomer. The German High Seas Fleet never actually surrendered. They simply went into internment, and I'll talk about that in the discussion today. Great. So with that, this article is available free on the internet, and it can be downloaded at your leisure. And you know, I hope you read it and enjoy it. So the First World War, we all know that it happened. It was 100 years ago, and during that war, you saw a lot of changes in technology, rapid changes. You had strategic bombing happening over London, where the Germans were actually targeting civilian populations. On the Western Front, you have machine guns, you have gas, you have new technologies that are making their way onto the battlefield. The problem is the generals were trained in the Napoleonic methods, and the carnage was just unbelievable on the Western Front and on other fronts as well of the First World War. And of course, in the war at sea, the Germans used unrestricted submarine warfare, which could arguably be compared with terrorism on the high seas. Piracy is one of the terms that the British propagandists used. But one of the things the British were very good at is propaganda. And the image that you see of a mother holding their child at the bottom of the ocean in the green haze of the deep oceans is an analogy for the murder and wanton carnage that took place. The other thing about this image is, to me, it captures the sickening elements of the First World War, the gas and you know, the carnage on the global stage. In the United States, we were neutral when the war broke out in 1914. However, a goodly number of Americans who are recent immigrants from Germany went down to the consulate and enlisted in the German army. One of the things that is missing in the narrative of the First World War is the fact that a lot of Americans, especially from the Midwest, Pennsylvania, enlisted in the German army, and many of them went to Europe and fought in the German ranks. So, you know, when you think about the British, French, and American relationship, it's pretty complicated. When you think about the German-American relationship, it's very complicated. And a lot of those complications are playing out in the global stage, even though the United States was neutral in that First World War. The United States was part of that war as well. And of course, we all know about the Lusitania sinking and the fact that targeting civilian passenger ships was something that you wouldn't necessarily want to do. But the Germans were trying to intimidate the British into surrendering sooner than later. And they were also trying to intimidate the United States. And in the United States, Woodrow Wilson said, you know what, we're not going to become part of these European wars. We're not a country that wants to be an empire. We have responsibilities as a nation, but we're not going to be dragged in to foreign conflicts. And so Woodrow Wilson had a policy known as the Navy second to none. And the concept of a Navy second to none was, we're going to have a better Navy than any other Navy in this global stage. And our Navy doesn't fight wars, they wage peace. And so by having very capable warships, such as the Arizona, which is one of the ships that we all know about as it was constructed after 1914, those ships were oil-fired, single-caliber guns, and they were very fast. And from a European point of view, those American ships were very serious. And so the Europeans had an incentive not to pick a fight with us. So as the war progressed, the British kept trying to get the United States into it, and the Germans kept trying to intimidate the United States out of it. There's an interesting character who I mentioned earlier. This is Nathaniel Sims's grandfather. His name is Admiral Sims. And of course, Admiral Sims is an interesting guy. And in 1910, he went to Europe in his ship called the Minnesota. And they threw a big party for the visit of the Minnesota at Guildhall in downtown London. Now, this is where the captains of British industry and the empire gather. And during the party, Sims stood up and said, if ever comes a time when the British Empire is seriously menaced by an external enemy, it is my opinion that you may count on every man, every dollar, and every drop of your kindred across the seas. This was known in the New York Times newspaper as the love feast in London. Kaiser Wilhelm complained about this speech. The Imperial Japanese sent a formal statement saying, what does he mean that you're going to defend the British Empire? So you see the sinews of future wars. You see the foundations for conflict just within the context of American sentiments towards the British Empire. 1917 is a pitiful and pivotal year for the United States. In 1917, the Zimmerman telegram, which was a message that was sent from Arthur Zimmerman to Ebert down in Mexico City, talking about supporting the Mexican insurgents if they wanted to take Texas, Arizona, New Mexico back. There was also a proviso in this statement that if the Japanese wanted to take California and Hawaii, that the Germans would support that as well. Now, the policy of neutrality was not sustainable in those circumstances from a political standpoint. And so Woodrow Wilson, on 6 April, 1917, declared war on Germany. Now in European waters, this gentleman, William S. Sims, the president of the Naval War College, arrived on a ship called the SS New York, which struck a mine as she came into Liverpool. The guy on the far left is John Jellicoe, who is these are both the grandfathers of my co-authors. Jellicoe was the first Sea Lord, and Sims arrives in London 4 days after the declaration of war. And Jellicoe said, well, you're the most senior American in London at the moment. Where's your uniform? Sims did not have a uniform because he was told not to bring a uniform because Woodrow Wilson didn't know if he was actually going to declare war when the ship got underway. So when Sims arrived in London, he had no uniform. And of course, he was about to meet people like the King, Winston Churchill, and others. And so Jellicoe said, you know what, let's get you a uniform. And Jellicoe helped Sims get a uniform. This is actually the uniform, which is on display here at the Naval War College in our museum. And you can see the date of the uniforms being made at Stovall and Mason in London. At the time, Admiral Sims was still technically in the rank of captain. This is an admiral's uniform. Now, Admiral Sims had been selected for promotion, but the actual promotion was still not widely promulgated within the Navy. And so when Admiral Sims appears in an admiral's uniform, the British immediately celebrate the arrival of Admiral Sims, and they declare him to be the commander of US naval forces in Europe. Now, that if you thought that Sims was the commander of US naval forces in Europe in Washington, many people were saying, who is this guy and why is he in London? He was actually on a secret mission to establish communications with the Admiralty, but his orders were very vague, and they certainly were not to be the commander of US naval forces in Europe. But by default, and because of the propaganda, this is exactly what he became.
So a question, you mentioned that one of the ships, was it the one from Sims, got hit a landmine in Liverpool Harbor? Was that his ship, the ship that he was on?
That was a passenger ship called the New York, and
Okay.
and she struck a sea mine as she was coming into Liverpool. So
Okay.
Sims was on board that ship when that happened. So he came in with a bang, and of course, when he gets this uniform, it really creates a problem within the United States chain of command. And Sims ended up going to Queenstown for a temporary assignment as the commander of Western Approaches, which is in the Royal Navy's chain of command. Because of that, Sims became the very first American naval officer to hold command over foreign warships. So you think about that, 100 years ago, this is the guy who first commanded within the context of a coalition navy. That's a big deal. Nowadays, of course, we're used to doing that. We've been doing it for 100 years, but Sims was the first. And there was really no book written on how to do this job. So he really had to do the best he can with what he had. And he did a pretty good job in a very challenging circumstance. So this is Nat Sims actually in the same place where his grandfather that is, stood 100 years ago. Today, the Admiralty House in Queenstown, now known as Cove, is actually a convent. It's a closed order. I'm raised Catholic and educated in the Catholic Church, and it was the best pre-military training you could get. And it was a wonderful day, for me at least, to be there on the same grounds with the grandson of Admiral Sims, visiting the place where he commanded US naval forces as well as British naval forces in Europe from Queenstown.
Was that, what else was in, who else was in the alliance? So Britain and America, as soon as and are we officially joining, or had we not officially joined when Sims took command in Europe?
That's a great question. At the time, we were known as an amalgamated force. We were not known as an allied force. We were specifically at war with Germany, not the Ottoman Empire, and not with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Those declarations actually came later from an American point of view. So it's a very ambiguous relationship. But here's Sims just kind of taking charge, doing the old Navy thing and saying, you know what, I've got a job to do. I'm going to do it until somebody tells me not to do it. And that's exactly what he did. And of course, when Pershing arrives in June of 1917.
Now, which one is Pershing? Which one is Pershing?
Pershing is on the far left. You can see Sims in the middle. Okay. You can see that the British are also sort of trying to influence the situation as much as possible. But this is not a joint command relationship. Admiral Sims is the commander of US naval forces in Europe. And at this stage, he only had a couple of destroyers based out of Queenstown, Cove, Ireland. So there's not a big naval presence yet. Pershing is arriving with the American Expeditionary Force. That is an Army unit. So Sims has no command over the Army side of it. The War Department, for which Pershing served, of course, said, you know, Colonel Pershing ought to be a 3-star. So they gave him a third star before he arrived in London. Sims, you can see, is standing in his 2-star uniform. Technically, at this point in June, he's actually a 3-star admiral. So this picture is an interesting picture from the standpoint of command and control relationships. And of course, who's in charge? Sims is like 5 years senior to Pershing in terms of lineal precedence. Pershing is junior to Sims. He's also the Army guy. How's he going to get to France without the Navy? And so it's a real problem. And it was never actually worked out during the First World War. And that's part of the problem when you get to the pandemic part of this. This is a slide that's meant to show you the rise and perhaps fall of Admiral Sims. In April of 1917, he adopted the rank of 2-star to do the job he was asked to do. By July, he was formally promoted to 3-star rank. By December of 1918, after the armistice of November of 1918, he's promoted to 4-star rank. And by January of 1919, he's back to 2-star. So he only held the 4-star rank for a maybe 3-week period before he reverted to a 2-star rank formally in order to go back to Newport as president of the United States Naval War College.
He's a little happier in the July 17 picture as he's going up than he is in the January 2000 or 1919 picture on his way down.
It's always hard to fall, I think, but you know, in the end, what the story of Sims tells us is you can persevere through thick and thin if you just do the job you can do to the best of your ability. And you know, that's something that we can all draw inspiration from, especially in the context of a pandemic as we are today. So jumping ahead, the armistice happened in November of 1918. Under the terms of the armistice, the war didn't end. Under the terms of the armistice, the German High Seas Fleet, which had fought the Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland just 2 years before, in an epic battle in the North Sea, under the command, by the way, of John Jellicoe, my co-author's grandfather. And here they are, undefeated in battle. And they have to turn themselves in to Scapa Flow, which is in the northern part of Scotland. And it's, you know, right after the armistice. And they sit there until they ultimately scuttle in the summer of 1919 in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. But this is not the surrender of the High Seas Fleet. It's actually just the High Seas Fleet reporting to Scapa Flow as ordered to sit in internment as the diplomats are working out the armistice to end the First World War, which doesn't happen until 1919. At this point, Sims is so popular that, you know, the media basically made him a 4-star admiral. But within the ranks of the United States Navy, a goodly number of people did not like Sims very much. And so his appointment to 4 stars was very controversial among some of the ranks in the Navy. Sims was a reformer. He had some very interesting ideas, a revolutionary thinker. I would argue he's responsible most within the ranks of the United States Navy for creating what we have today in the 21st century. So Sims is one of these innovators that we should all remember quite well. And he's right in the mix of a lot of things. Right. So as they're sitting up there in Scapa Flow, the United States Navy is sending its battleship squadron that is actually operating with the Grand Fleet. And the German fleet is just sitting there in Scapa Flow under the combined guns of the French, British, and US navies. So, and there's a lot of tensions between the Germans and the Americans and the British and everything else. While the British and the Americans are playing baseball or football, soccer ashore, the Germans are just sitting there rotting on their own ships. Food's running low. Nobody's trading Christmas cards at this point because the war is still on. And ultimately, the Spanish flu hits the fleet. And so you can see a picture of one of our US Navy sailors being sent home from Scotland. Actually, he was not sent home. He was buried in a grave in England, but they didn't tell the sailors who were sitting up there, the US Navy sailors were not told that if you die of influenza, we're not shipping your body home. So, you know, they ended up burying a lot of those guys over there.
If you died of a gunshot wound or an explosion or some other cause, you got shipped home for a military style burial. But if you died of the Spanish flu, that was not the case?
It's dependent. If you died of the Spanish flu, the authorities really didn't want to ship the bodies home. They did ship some victims of the Spanish flu home, but a good number of them also just ended up staying in Europe, or some of them were actually buried at sea. So it's not a happy tale for those who did die within the ranks of the United States Navy of Spanish flu. And of course, you know, the big thing is cleanliness. And up in Scapa Flow and in other ports where U.S. Navy forces were deployed in Europe, every day was a cleanup day. And, you know, it was a lot of work just sitting there, not really doing anything operational, trying to keep the German High Seas Fleet in check as they are negotiating the Treaty of Versailles. And some really interesting characters are coming to Europe as well. Here we see the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, visiting the forces up in Scapa Flow, actually, on board the Texas. And so it's interesting that Franklin Roosevelt, when he goes to Europe, he also contracts the Spanish flu when he gets there. And, you know, I'm not a medical guy, but it probably was a precipitating factor in his becoming stricken with polio later on. So there's some interesting stuff in relation to the ending of the First World War. And of course, here's Woodrow Wilson, his Wilsonian 14 points, his vision for a League of Nations. And of course, this is an idea that later on, Franklin Roosevelt is inspired by the idea of the League of Nations. He wants to replicate it actually in the Second World War with the United Nations, and that became a desired end state in the Second World War. But the League of Nations was a hard sell. That the Americans showed up to Versailles and they said, you know what, we're not gonna foster empires anymore. We want to see a League of Nations. And as part of the proviso in the Treaty of Versailles, they said, okay, we'll form our League of Nations and it'll be a wonderful thing and it's just gonna work great. They signed the Treaty of Versailles in the same room that the Kaiser of the Second Reich was crowned as king in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War. So the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles is where the German king was coronated in 1871. And symbolically, in 1919, in the very same room, they signed the Treaty of Versailles to formally end the First World War in June of 1919. So when we say World War I ended in 1918, it did not end in 1918, formally at least. It ended in 1919. And of course, this whole idea of a League of Nations was an American idea. And when Wilson came home and said, let's have a League of Nations to Congress, we all know how efficient that process can be. Congress did not ratify the League of Nations. And so this is a cartoon from a European newspaper of the period in which they say, look, you know, here's the League of Nations, but the keystone to the League of Nations is not available to complete the process. So, you know, this was really a problem later on when the United States, in the context of the Second World War, was trying to convince the other allies that we should create a United Nations. The other allies were very skeptical of that idea, and it took a while to get momentum to create the United Nations. And all of this is affected by the Spanish flu pandemic that is unfolding in the trenches and in the water, the fleets deployed to Europe. Now, another issue up in Scapa Flow is all these idle German sailors. You can see German officers sort of having a wonderful day. It's the prerogative of an officer to have, you know, china plates, and in this case, you know, you can see the sailor behind him pouring glasses of wine for his officers. And within the enlisted ranks of the German High Seas Fleet, there were a lot of pamphlets being spread around because these guys are bored, there's nothing to do. And a lot of those pamphlets are communist propaganda. And so what ends up happening is the German sailors are already in revolt from the sailor revolt of the fall of 1918, which is a precursor to the armistice, but there's still a revolt against officer class. And one of the things that the German sailors started wearing was red bands on their arms. So, you know, later on when you see the red bands of the Nazis and all of that, there's an interesting sort of fashion statement that's happening among the German sailors in the High Seas Fleet in the First World War when they're wearing red armbands in defiance of the rank structure of the High Seas Fleet. And of course, this is all feeding into a lot of hate and discontent within the German Navy ranks. Here you can see sailors standing up against their officers saying, "We are not following your orders." And this is the precursor to a lot of trouble that's going on when the Germans are just sitting up there idly in Scapa Flow. A lot of bad feelings among the enlisted and the officer class. And so with the news of the Treaty of Versailles, the flu is spreading throughout the ranks on both sides. In June, the Germans finally had enough, and they refused to turn in their ship.
June of 1919?
Correct, yes, sir. So this image is what you see is the scuttling of the German High Seas Fleet in the summer of 1919, and those ships went to the bottom. The British actually fired upon the German sailors as they approached the British ships, and they said, "Get back to your ship and go save your ship." They actually fired upon some Germans, and some were killed. Some German sailors as they were trying to make their way to the British ship as their ships are sinking behind them. So I mean, this was a bloody mess to say the least. But it was
what was the goal when the Germans were doing this? When the German Navy enlisted men were rebelling against their leadership and scuttling their ships to basically quit their Navy post, what was their goal? Was their goal to stop participating in the war and surrender?
So the first sailor revolt happened in 1918 before the armistice. And that sailor revolt happened because they got orders to get underway. And that was a suicide mission, because the combined forces of the French, British, and American, there was no way the German High Seas Fleet could take them on even terms. And the enlisted sailors, with their communist propaganda in their heads, they said, we're not going to do that, and refused to do it. And so the armistice happened. And then they sat there in Scapa Flow, and they're reading their communist propaganda. And the German officers were having a terrible time keeping good order and discipline on board their ships. And when the Treaty of Versailles finally got signed, the Germans actually executed a very well planned out scuttling of their own fleet in order to deny the British, the Americans, and the French access to the ships that they had maintained as best they could. So it was a last scuttle. It was a last sign of utter defiance against the Allies. And this is, of course, the birth of ideas. Here's a ship, the Hindenburg, at the bottom of Scapa Flow. Actually, she's resting on the bottom. A lot of the hulls were salvaged later on for the metal. But this is the seeds of what would become the Nazi movement in Germany. This was called the Durchstoß. So in other words, the stab in the back that Hitler talks about. And of course, Hitler was one of the guys in the trenches, and he's radicalized in the trenches. And, the German sailor revolt, the influence of communism within the ranks was something that Hitler despised. And many Germans were skeptical of the idea of communism. And the whole National Socialist mythology comes out of the First World War. And of course, what is known as the Durchstoß, which is a stab in the back.
Help us understand the pictures back there. So that's Hitler in the bottom picture in 23. And then to the left, who's in the left?
So far left on the bottom, that is Corporal Hitler on the Western Front in the First World War. In the middle, in 1923, the Guildhall Putsch, he's standing next to General von Ludendorff, who was the supreme commander of the German armed forces in the First World War. Ludendorff hated Adolf Hitler. However, he agreed with Adolf Hitler about the problem of communism. And of course, Ernst J is also seen in that picture, and he became the leader of the SA. Missing in the picture, of course, is Hermann Göring, who would later at the Guildhall Putsch also help sow the seeds of Nazism. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see a decorated German officer in his uniform. He's, Iron Cross. He's got the wound badge. He's got looks like pilot's qualification. I mean, he can't get a job, and he doesn't have a leg. So, it's a desperate situation economically. And of course, the pandemic is looming over all of this as well. Communism is another idea that's floating around, and in the United States, the communist ideology was spreading among the lower working class. So, if you were a meat packer somewhere, you might be unionizing and you might be thinking about communism as a good idea. If you were in Jim Crow South, communism is something that appeals because it's one way of saying to, the white supremacists that it's not acceptable for you to oppress me. And so communism is an interesting trend that's going on, coincident with the labor movements. And of course, the Spanish flu is not necessarily killing the wealthy. It is definitely killing the working class. And that's probably a trend that we can look for in the future as we watch the pandemic today unfold. So one of the things about the First World War and the pandemic is the pandemic is striking Europe very hard. And, the guys are coming home and they're sick. And as they're coming home, they don't realize how deadly the pandemic really is. And so in 1918, the first indications of pandemic happened actually at an army camp, but it's the sailors returning home in Boston who are actually bringing home Spanish flu, and it's on the East Coast where it really explodes, and it spreads across the country in 1918, and it does come in waves. And you can see the number of folks who are they're coming home, and they're bringing with them not only the stress of having seen combat on an unprecedented scale, but also the sickness, the pandemic that was spreading in Europe. And this is just a couple of pictures that give you a sense of how close everybody was on board ship. One of the interesting characters in this story is this young strapping bosun's mate, and his name is Humphrey Bogart. And he was assigned to the USS Leviathan. And one of the things that Humphrey Bogart experienced on board the Leviathan was the flu pandemic. And it spread like wildfire on board the USS Leviathan. And that experience actually, kind of influenced how Humphrey Bogart saw the world. And of course, you can see in his acting, he really had an experience in the First World War. By all accounts, he was an excellent sailor. There's a lot of stories about him getting into a fight and getting the scar that's so famous. But in fact, having looked into it, I believe the story that he ended up getting hit on the lip and getting that scar when they were doing gunnery practice. I don't think it was a fight based upon the research I've done. But who knows?
Couple questions. On the previous slide on this one, what were the markings all about?
That's dazzle painting. Dazzle painting was an experimental concept. It was not used in the Second World War, but in the First World War, people assumed that if you do dazzle painting, it's harder to see the ship. And in fact, it does kind of work, but they found out by the Second World War, they found out that if you're operating in the North Atlantic, it's just better to paint the ship pink, completely pink, in the North Atlantic. And in the Southern Atlantic, the US Navy used haze gray and ocean blue as a two-color scheme during the Second World War. But in the First World War, they actually, they experimented with these wild paint schemes as a means to avoid torpedo attack from a submarine or other, attacks from, for example, a German commerce raider. They're basically trying to blend into the horizon. But in the experiments, they ultimately determined that you can actually see the ship quite fine, and dazzle painting was not widely used after the First World War. As I said, as the guys are coming home, this is actually the Philadelphia Navy Yard. And as you can see, don't spit, you you're spreading the virus. And people are worried. People are, you know, they have to go to work. They did not do stay-at-home orders. They didn't do that. They just continued working. Working class, of course, had to go to work in order to feed themselves. The higher social classes, of course, were able to stay home and basically isolate as required. So, you know, the flu spread in 1918 like wildfire into 1919. It did come in waves. It seemed to be seasonal, which is, we don't know what the COVID, you know, so it's not, you can't really compare the viruses, but 100 years ago, it seemed to be a seasonal type of situation. And ultimately 1920, 21, it starts to fade out. Around the world, however, the Spanish flu seemed to continue into the 1920s. And I've read that the first incidence of Spanish flu might have been as early as 1913. So, you know, these pandemics are hard to track. And as a historian, I'm not a medical historian at all, but it is interesting to read some of the medical history that's out there about, you know, when did these things start and when did they end? And in many respects, the Spanish influenza never really ended. It just kind of faded out. Here you see some of the countermeasures here in the United States. Early masks that are adopted. You can see their mouths are not covered. It's just their noses. I think very fashionable. Josephus Daniels was the Secretary of the Navy. He's the one in the left of the picture. And one of the things that Josephus Daniels asked Admiral Braistad, and he was the Surgeon General of the US Navy, what he said was, don't treat the civilians. Focus on the sailors. Take care of the sailors. Don't worry about the taxpayers. Don't treat the civilians. And they did issue orders not to treat civilians. And of course, those orders were immediately ignored at the ground level. And the doctors in the United States Navy and in the Army said, you know what, I see the order. I understand, you know, the admirals and the Secretary of the Navy, that's all very fine, but I'm a doctor, I'm a naval officer, and I'm a human being, and I'm going to treat these sick people. And a goodly number of US Navy doctors and medical personnel succumbed to Spanish flu because they made the decision to treat the stricken. Here in Newport, the Spanish flu hit very hard. Here you can see the tar paper barracks that were constructed. The Newport base expanded exponentially during the First World War because, of course, we thought we were mobilizing for a long period, but that didn't happen. So they mobilized a lot of people, and they were just sitting idly around as the flu struck. Those tar paper barracks are no longer here, but some of the terrain is very familiar to those of us who have been to Newport. This is actually a picture from a hospital down south, and as you can see the masks that are being worn by the medical personnel, and the stricken sailors are actually not masked. So, you know, this flu, they were doing the best they could with what they had in fine naval tradition, but a goodly number of folks died as they were trying to deal with this pandemic. This is actually an Army hospital where influenza patients are dealing with the situation. They did discover that outdoors was best for the influenza because, you know, the clean air and the breeze seemed to help. And so the hospitals ended up moving outdoors. And so what you see are a lot of sanitariums being, what they called sanitariums back then, being constructed across the country. And it was mostly outdoors. So you'd be in a tent until you got better or until you died. Here we see the tent farm in Newport. The Naval War College, the famous building of the Naval War College is just to the left of center.
Wait, which is the Naval War College building? Upper left, where is it? You said left center.
So here you have,
Gotcha. Okay.
this is Founders Hall,
Okay.
and this is Loose Hall, as we call it. Back then, this was the Naval War College building, and this was the base headquarters building. However, in 1884, this is the first building of the Naval War College. This building was built in 1892, and it was called the Naval War College. And then in the 1930s, these buildings were renamed. This remained the base headquarters. This became Loose Hall. There's a building here that's not in this picture called Mahan Hall that was built in the 30s. And so they renamed a lot of the buildings after some key players in the history of the Naval War College. This became Founders Hall formally in 1970s. You can see the YMCA building, which is no longer there. But this tent farm and the YMCA, this is a nice little bubble of influenza that really exploded here in Newport in 1918, 1919 timeframe. Here you see a nice sort of graphic depiction of influenza from a Navy standpoint, how it sort of ebbed and flowed. And I think we're seeing a lot of that today in the COVID crisis with these ebbs and flows of sickness coming and going. So if history is any guide, we probably need to strap in for a little bit of a long haul until the doctors can catch up to whatever this current situation is.
What do the colors on this graph represent?
The colors are different locations. So this is a receiving ship, Boston. This is a Newport. Green is Newport. I'm having a hard time reading something. Here's Quantico. Orange is Quantico. So these are different locations being depicted as to where influenza cases hit and where they are taking tolls on people. I will hasten to point out this group. Here you see Admiral Braisted again. Here he is, and he's part of the military task force that President Wilson established to deal with the influenza pandemic. So, you know, when we talk about the task force here in the COVID situation, history never repeats itself, but sometimes you can see some trends. If this chart provides any sort of a flavor of what happened in the past, you can see that it comes in waves, and finally, as you know, we hope, it starts to pan out later on. It just starts to fade away.
But this chart shows a shorter duration of those facilities covered by the chart from August to November. You and I know right now, if you go March, April, May, June, July, we're now in the 5th month counting March. And we're the end of the last 5 months. And this chart doesn't show even 5 months. You know what I mean? August, right. September, October, November. So this appears to be a shorter duration, at least among these charts. So
there are other charts. This is out of the official U.S. Navy report. This is a sampling of one of the charts that provides a nice snapshot in time. However, the report is available online. If you go out and if you download my article with Nick Jellicoe and Nat Sims, if you download that, the citation to the report is there, and you can actually go online and read the full report as prepared after the fact by the Secretary of the Navy and submitted to Congress. The casualties were very high, and you know, continued to be so. And finally, in 1919, 1920, it seemed like it was going away, but there were still cases that lingered into the 1920s. And of course, the mask is emblematic of the pandemic of 1918, 1920. And I suspect that the mask will become a symbol of COVID, although, you know, history is yet to be written. Now, one of the problems with the influenza is you had to pay for the war. And so one of the things that we did 100 years ago is we actually had Liberty Loan. And so this is actually a portrait or a poster of a fundraising effort that happened in 1919, right at the height of the pandemic. It's one of my favorite posters, by the way. It's a true classic, which captures the First World War at sea, I think, quite well. But the purpose of the poster is actually to raise money after the war's over in order to pay for the war. And so one of the ways of doing that is you have parades. And so you're paying for the war by getting people excited about the victory in the war. And of course, when you have these parades, the pandemic just gets worse. So as you're trying to pay for the victory, you're actually paying for the victory in lives. This is Admiral Sims, of course, returning here to Newport on parade in April of 1919. And at the time, the pandemic was starting to subside here in Newport. But when Sims came home, the local population was still reeling from the pandemic. But again, it's hard, when the war ends, everybody wants to celebrate people coming home. And that's exactly what they did. But it just made matters worse with the pandemic happening at the same time. And of course, there's Admiral Sims with Franklin Roosevelt as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the famous portrait of our ships arriving for the first time in Queenstown behind them. The original portrait, by the way, is at the Naval Academy on display. I highly recommend you go see it. It's a beautiful, beautiful painting. And of course, what I like about this image is we can start to see what the future holds. Admiral Sims being a great naval hero in many respects, the first American to command foreign forces in the context of a coalition. He made it up as he went. And you see the future president of the United States, who is learning lessons from that experience of the First World War, and later on would apply those lessons in the Second World War context. And one of the things that I would close with today is Admiral Sims had a wonderful sort of missive that he would tell his friends: remain cheerful. That's how he always sort of looked at the world. The world is a dangerous place, and there's a lot of evil in the world. And one of the things that Sims encouraged us to do is remain cheerful. And I think that's the best way I can close what is really a dark tale in the history of mankind, which is the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920s. And just remain cheerful out there. Now, the opinions expressed by me today are not the opinions of the United States Naval War College or of the United States Navy. However, they are opinions that are formed based upon original research as reflected in the article that I've written with Nicholas Jellicoe and Nat Sims on behalf of history. And I hope you find it of interest. And with that, I'm open to your questions. Thank you so much.
Is it your opinion that as many people died of the pandemic then as from military injuries, ballpark?
Well, so more people died of the pandemic than in combat. However, they wouldn't have been dying of pandemic if they were not serving in the military in close quarters on bases or on ships with nothing much to do. We need to think about the fact that when you put the uniform on, whether it's peace or war, you're putting the cloth of the nation on, and you're accepting the risks inherent with whatever the nation is asking you to do, from the commander-in-chief through the officers appointed above in the rank structure. And sometimes you're asked to swab a deck with a mop, and that swabbing of the deck during a gunnery exercise might not be good for your health. You may fall overboard. There may not be enemy action at all. You may be walking through a hatch, and the hatch slams shut on your head, and you could die without enemy action. So, the word service is an important word, I think. Whether you're a combat soldier or even if you're a secretary in the rear with the gear, as we say, you're serving, and you're doing the job that the nation has asked you to do. And sometimes pandemics strike, and that's just the way it goes. So I would say, you know, when we accept orders into the service, you're accepting the consequences of those orders, but you're doing it for the betterment of the nation and ultimately all humanity, hopefully at least.
How long did it take from catching the first exposure, getting first exposure, to dying? And how does that compare with COVID?
Well, I think the Spanish flu, like any other flu, comes on. It came on like the flu comes on, and for some people, they died very quickly. For others, they
Like
lingered.
days? Like a few days?
Like maybe 2 or 3 days, you'd be dead. And the reason is because they died primarily. They drowned essentially. They died of pneumonia primarily. And so, if you were an older person or just, you know, not as healthy as you'd like to be, you know, you might not last very long. A lot of the soldiers and sailors who caught the flu were, you know, they were fit, and some of them lingered. And, you know, I've seen color images of flu victims that are hand drawn. So, you know, the artist was capturing. And what would happen is you'd turn a bright pink, and eventually you would turn purple, and then you would die. So it was an ugly death. It wasn't an easy one. And, you know, they didn't give alcohol, for example, to the patients who desperately probably needed it to help clear the throats and all that, because of course you had prohibition hitting, and, you know, the teetotaling ideas and all that. And, you know, there were some weird medical experiments that were happening also to try and treat the flu. I don't think we're seeing that type of dynamic today. From what I can tell, it looks like the CDC is doing a very good job.
So how did your military career start?
All 4 of my grandparents served in the military during the Second World War. My great-grandfather was on the wrong team in the First World War. He was a German guy. And so I grew up in a community that was split between Irish and Germans by descent. I ended up following in the footsteps of my grandpa Duffy on my mom's side, and he was part of Darby's Rangers in World War II. Great inspiration to me. He came home from World War II, wounded 3 times. He fixed cars at Sears Roebuck, 8th grade educated, and probably the smartest man I ever knew. And he inspired me to join the Army originally. And I served in the Army from 1988, enlisted guy, from 1988 until 1995. I was a corporal at one point. I did study at art school, so there's a problem with corporals in art school, historically speaking. And I did eventually become an officer.
Wasn't Hitler an art student who was a corporal?
Hitler was a corporal in the German army, and yes, he studied art. I was an art student, and yes, I became a corporal in the army. And then I went to OCS, and I became a second lieutenant, platoon leader in the infantry, and very proudly served in the army just like my grandpa Duffy did. And my grandma Duffy was an army nurse in World War II, out in New Guinea, Philippines, Okinawa. So, you know, I was inspired to follow as best I could in their footsteps. Ultimately, in 1995, the Army was downsizing. So I took the opportunity to go to graduate school. And I went to a school in Virginia, right on the coast. And my professor said, well, what do you want to write about? And I told him, you know, I want to write about World War I and all that. And they said, well, okay, you'll write about the Navy. Being an infantry officer from Iowa, I had no interest whatsoever in the Navy. But when you start studying maritime history and you see that maritime affairs are global, and you start to recognize that the primary purpose of navies is to avoid the war in the first instance. So the objective in a war from a Navy point of view is the establishment of sustained peace. So you can't do that by fighting wars. You got to win the wars. So it's a different mindset from the Army in some respects. And that appealed to me, and that drew me into the United States Navy, where I became a reserve intelligence officer. And I served as a reserve intelligence officer when I was mobilized in 2001. I went to Fifth Fleet and worked for a guy named Sam Cox originally, who was the N2, the intelligence officer for Fifth Fleet. And then a guy named Jim Mattis showed up, and he formed Task Force 58, and I supported Task Force 58. It was just heady days. I came home in 2002 and went back to my job in Chicago at the Museum of Science and Industry. And then in 2003, we invaded Iraq, and I was going to be mobilized again. So I took what they call a recall tour, and I became a destroyer squadron intelligence officer and made a number of underway deployments at sea. And I did what they call an IA in Iraq. And then again, in 2010, I went to Iraq, basically, I think, to turn the lights off, because I was in Iraq until 2011. And then I came to the Naval War College as part of the staff at the Naval War College. And of course, today I'm where I am now as a historian. I went to King's London, where I studied with Andrew Lambert. And while I was here at the Naval War College as a student, before that, I studied with John Hattendorf, the namesake of the Hattendorf Historical Center.
Wonderful. Well, David Kohnen, PhD, maritime historian, and commander in the US Navy, with over 30 years of service for our country, including 2 tours to Iraq and over 1,000 days at sea in maritime deployments. We very much appreciate your time today on the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, and thank you very much for your great presentation on the Spanish flu and how it relates to and what we can learn from it about the COVID-19 pandemic hitting America right now. Thank you very, very much, and with that, we adjourn the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.